For the last couple of weeks, we've been trying to talk about some contemporary philosophers, and Slavoj Zizek is hard to leave off the list. So I wanted to do this presentation on him. The title for this uh, particular look we're going to take at him is Ecology, and also, which is almost always in his presentations, the role of ideology. Then also, as far as ecology is concerned, conceptions of nature are part of this. So Zizek is he's a pretty dynamic uh, philosopher, and speaks in a animated and energetic way. He's very engaging and kind of exciting to listen to, but not always easy to understand. But he's made an impact, so wanted to try to include him. There is one comment. It's like in frequently, like this for an intro to philosophy class. In my classes, I oftentimes ask people to write papers, relatively short papers, on particular philosophers, and invariably I'll ask them not to be too general in what they write about, but rather to try and focus in on a particular aspect of a philosopher, which would make it more interesting. It's easy for me to ask people to do that, and but I am aware that that's kind of oftentimes difficult. So it's hard to write intelligently about a particular aspect of a philosopher without having some comprehensive view of what that philosopher's position is, like in a general way. And I think that's particularly the case here with Slavoj Zizek. So we'll try and set the stage a little bit, because we are talking about a specific issue. In this instance, it's ecology. So I'll try and say a little bit more about that as we go into the next slide. The content of this particular discussion about ecology comes from an interview that was conducted by Astra Taylor. Although she doesn't speak very much in this particular interview, it's almost Slavoj Zizek entirely. And again, I mean, it covers these, as I've already said, it covers these three topics in particular: the ecology, naturally, and also the conception of nature contained within the ecological way of thinking about the things. And Zizek's insistence that there's a kind of ideology involved here that doesn't necessarily help. So that's kind of the background for a lot of what the discussion is going to be. The place for this particular discussion is in London, in a recycling center. Taylor always tried to do her interviews not in academic settings, but tried to bring philosophy out into the street, which we've seen previously. So here we're actually at a recycling center. So it's quite an image if you check out the video of this interview. There's also a text version of it, which both of which will be available. Let's say about Zizek. I mean, he has an interesting. I said, you need to know something about where a particular philosopher comes from, in order to understand his point of view, and that's the case with Zizek. He's a Slovenian philosopher, and you could say he's kind of a psychoanalytic, he brings psychoanalytic perspectives into philosophy. He's also functions as a social and a culture critic. His major influences, I have them listed here as Hegel, Marx, and Lacan. Hegel initially, and then you could say Hegel was kind of, we didn't talk about Hegel in our class. Hegel was an important philosopher, and Hegel thought that history was controlled by a kind of dialectical movement which takes place in history of different, positives and negatives. So you have a kind of dialectic between them, and then now and again a synthesis is arrived at, but then the process continues. The synthesis becomes a beginning of a new movement. And then Marx, for Hegel, it was kind of a spiritual movement taking place in history, in the realization of the absolute spirit and time. Marx was a student of Hegel's, but he kind of denied the existence of spiritual dimensions. So Marx gave the same kind of analysis of history as being governed by this dialectical progression. But for Marx, it was always he was a materialist. So for him, it was dialectical materialism, and he saw that as history was governed by the struggle for the control of the means of production in economic systems. So it was always a struggle between the rich and the poor, capitalist and proletariat, and so on. And Marx thought it would inevitably lead towards some sort of ideal kind of society as well. So there's strains of that in the way that Zizek thinks about things. So he has this idea of the dialectic as a way, as a kind of methodology, trying to understand things, trying to understand both sides and come to a kind of synthesis from it. Thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. And he's also interested in Marxist theory, and which involves a kind of opposition to capitalism in Marx's case. So Zizek is like critical of capitalistic systems, and then he's also becomes interested in Lacan. I think is the last influence that he is exposed to, and Lacan is a French psychoanalyst and following, I would say, in the footsteps of Freud, but kind of a neo-Freudian in a way. So there's a lot of psychoanalytic jargon used in Zizek's presentation. And you get this, kind of critique of capitalism and of Western cultures and so forth. So that's kind of the mix that we see. Complicated mix. I asked the class, or I provided for the class, another video to look at just as background on Zizek, and that was a St. John's Timeline video by Marcus Pound, who talks about, gives us a little more information about Zizek and his background and how he saw things. Pound kind of jokes at the beginning how one of the things that Zizek warned people about was trying to explain a complicated teaching by your explanations even more complicated than the teaching. And so Pound says he's at risk of doing that, and maybe I think he's guilty of doing it when you look at his video. And so we run the same risk. I mean, trying to explain something complicated. And if we're good at it, we simplify it for people, not make it more complicated. So, yeah, let's see how this plays out, how all these items are connected and all these different threads come together in this discussion. I think a big topic for Zizek is always ideology, and that he talks a lot about ideology in relationship to ecology. So we start by trying to say, what is an ideology? And we could say it's a set of ideas or principles. I think usually we would think of that term as describing a political orientation, political theory, get a certain ideology that somebody who embraces that, and that would uh, help you understand that person's point of view about various issues. So ideology can also relate to cultural issues or economics. You could say it's a way of thinking about something. And here I thought Pound's comments were interesting, and he said it's kind of like having a background scene. You know, when in Pound's video, there's and in some videos there's like a projected screen behind the speaker, and images are projected that relate to what the speaker is talking about in any way, and it's changing. So that kind of complements what the speaker is saying. It also, gives a kind of uh, an approach, or kind of visually gives, describes the approach of the speaker as well. And you could say in psychoanalysis or in psychoanalytic ways of thinking about things that that's kind of an ideology functions like that for us, and it's kind of in the background or beneath the surface. There's always we're influenced by a certain way of thinking about certain problems, and you could say that's a kind of ideology that we have, and it sort of manifests in the way that we address issues of a particular kind. Zizek very generally says that ideology is usually a wrong way of thinking and proceeding about something. So it seems to be natural that we fall into the trap of ideologies, but from Zizek's point of view, it's sort of a problem for us to get past uh, ideological ways of thinking about things. He states that ideologies address real problems, but they address them in such a way that the problem is mystified. And because the problem's mystified, uh, they can't be addressed properly. There's something about the ideology that sort of throws a kind of cloud, confusing cloud, over what the problem actually is. It makes it difficult for us to address directly the problem. Zizek gives an example of ideology in the way people talk about racism today, and the tendency is to think of racism as a problem of intolerance. And um, from Zizek's point of view, that kind of is a mystification to think of racism as a problem of intolerance. He points out that for Martin Luther King, for instance, racism wasn't about intolerance. It was about struggle for equality, economic justice, and legal rights, and so forth. thinking of racism as a problem of intolerance sort of mystifies the issue. It confuses it and makes it more difficult to approach it, again, in a direct way. Intolerance makes of it kind of a cultural issue, and that's not really what the real problem is. Another example he gives of how ideologies work is he cites one of the mechanisms which is invested in ideology, and that's the temptation of meaning. And it's kind of temptation of meaning just means that we like to have things that happen to us in our life. We like to feel that they're meaningful in some way, and it troubles us that maybe there's no significance that to like a particular event that happens that affects me. In particular, when something bad happens, it's usually more acceptable if we think that there is some reason for it. He gives the example of AIDS, for instance, when people, the temptation of meaning, looking for meaning behind why is there AIDS, people, some conservative people wanted to think that it was a punishment from God, for instance, for some wrong way of living, in a way. You know, if that's the case, then it's not just some terrifying blind force, and even though it's not pleasant, it's still a universe of meaning. So there's something still a little that comforts us in the fact that we live in a world where things are meaningful, and instead of a world in which that's not the case. For Zizek, the problem of or the problems related to the ecology are the crucial field of ideology today. And if we if we think about ecology as an ideology, we want to see what the implicit premises of that approach are. And first of all, the premise is, or the belief is, that the existing world is the best possible world. The way things are prior to our messing it up is the best possible world, and that it's a world in which everything has been balanced, but then that balance is disturbed by human hubris or pride. So you could say, what's the problem with this premise? You can say there's two things. So first of all, the view, again according to Zizek, the view of nature as harmonious, balanced, organic, reproducing itself, a world in which is then disturbed or perturbed by human hubris, exploitation, etc. Zizek says you could think of this as a kind of secular version of the religious story of the fall. And his answer is not to say that there is no fall, but that there is no nature that corresponds with this idea. We can see, so there's just two steps in this. One is that he's going to argue that this conception of nature that we have that's behind our ecological thinking isn't doesn't fit the situation. And you can see this other thing about the fall, that it's the fault of humans. So again, there's this temptation of meaning involved, where there's it's human pride and so forth, which is what the problem, and that the problems that we're having with the ecology are kind of punishment for inappropriate human behavior. So we're going to look at both of these. For Zizek, nature is not a balanced totality that we humans then disturb. Instead, he's going to argue that nature is a big series of unimaginable catastrophes, and that sometimes we profit from these, and uses the example of the formation of oil reserves beneath the earth, which is the result of an unimaginable catastrophe. All that dead animal and plant matter, which becomes oil. For Zizek, we need to remember that that's part of our history, that's part of what nature is for us. So for him, we have a false idea about what nature is. What he seems to fear is that ecology will become, like Marx said about religion, that it was the opiate of the masses, and that that ecology will take the role of a kind of religion in our lives as a kind of unquestioned religious authority, a pious authority, as though uh, in religion traditionally God's word can't really be debated. I mean, it's not rational. It's just because God said it's so, that you have to accept that that's the way it is. So for for Marx, that statement that religion was the opiate of the masses was something he felt you had to get rid of in order for people to address their situation more properly. And it seems like Zizek has the same kind of thinking, that we kind of have to get rid of some of the false notions that we have about ecology in order to move forward properly. In this regard, it looks like ecological thinking is more and more taking on the role of a conservative ideology. There's all these cautions about don't do this or don't do that, don't mess with Mother Nature, don't mess with DNA, genetic engineering. There's generally a distrust of technology and a distrust of science, and a kind of attachment of, to some extent, of blame for the situation that we're in by going too far in these artificial directions. So these cautionary tales seem to be part of what the emphasis on ecology is sort of bringing to us. Also related to this is this idea that uh, that in the modern age that we're alienated, that we've become alienated really from the natural world, and that we need to be to get back in touch with our roots, kind of back to nature, movement, try and limit artificiality, to limit our reliance on technology so much. Uh, Zizek's position, calls this the greatest danger. Uh, I'm not entirely sure that I understand this, but he sees that there's a kind of that this kind of thinking leads to a kind of disconnect between what we know about the problems that we face and what we do about uh, ecological problems. For instance, we don't do anything, and that behind this disconnect, this kind of disavowal, I know, but there's kind of belief that ultimately nature will will win out, So it seems as though he feels that if we give in to this temptation or this lure, of going back to the natural world, trying to get back in touch with nature, that we'll lose sight of what the problem is, or we'll lose sight of the danger. And he says, when we go outside, go into my backyard, I see trees and grass, and it seems like everything's just fine. And but the problems, they don't really go away. And my enjoyment of the natural world, or my retreat to it, just kind of makes it easier for me not to address the real problems. To address the real problem, to confront it in a more immediate way, Zizek advocates that we move in the opposite direction of the back to nature movement. So we don't want to become new age people. We don't want to go back to nature, away from technology and so forth. But he's suggesting that we embrace even more the artificiality, to let it all in, and then to see if in that realm we can still create the finer things in life. Can we still create poetry in an artificial existence? Can we find spirituality? So this is surprising, that he's advocating this, but he's arguing that we need even more alienation and not less. And to the extent where we would enter into even a kind of abstract materialism. So this is, I think, exaggerated, but you can see that his point is, I think, that we address the reality of the situation that we're in terms of how to deal with the real ecological problems that we face. Ultimately, he's arguing that instead of fighting against it, we should love the situation. We should love the world with all its flaws. So this is kind of a neat uh, metaphor that he gives, or analogy. He says we should love the world with all its flaws, just like you love your mate or your significant other, man or woman. You don't insist on that they be perfect. I mean, you love them. You come to love them, and they're everything to you. You love them the way that they are. And he's suggesting that that's the relationship that we should have, with the world in which we live. Embrace it. Just a few comments to try and wrap this up. Although I don't think we can wrap it up, but we'll bring it to a close at any rate. First of all, I wanted to note that at the end of the text version of the interview, Zizek advocates that we accept the imbalance that we are. He's previously said he wants us to love the world, including the trash, but then he notes that we're not masochists, and that the truth is that we don't like trash, we hate trash. And so we love, he wants us to love, and we also, these are both aspects of the way that we relate to reality. We love some things, we hate other things. We're imbalanced in this way. Zizek is saying that should be accepted. That's what we are. That's who we are, and we should accept that we love and accept that we hate just as well. Taylor points out to him that shift, how at one moment he's saying that we should love everything, then next moment he's saying it's okay to hate, and so forth. So Zizek, he just laughs and says, yeah, we'll see what works. But there is something, it's kind of trying to a kind of psychological relationship with ourselves, where we kind of have to include all the aspects of who we are and accept that. So I think that's part of his agenda, what he's after. I think it's safe to say that, and it's even Taylor says it, at some point she doesn't agree with some of the things he has to say, and I confess neither do I. When, for instance, when he says that nature is just a series of unimaginable catastrophes, uh, uh, I'm saying, okay, but that doesn't sum up what nature is. I mean, there are unimaginable catastrophes in the history of the world, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been long periods of stability in between such catastrophes. And it's in the in between stretches of time where you could say there's a kind of relative order and balance is achieved. I mean, we still have physical laws, there's kind of regularity in the world, and even a kind of balance. Everything is not chaotic in our experience of reality. We could say the moon orbits the earth orbits the sun, and there's a kind of regularity. I mean, one season follows another, and so forth. So there is a kind of balance in nature. All is not chaos, and it does seem that that human beings, and human activity can have an impact on how things function in the natural world, and we should be aware of what that is. So that's one point. It's useful, I mean, for all of us. I mean, when we listen to what people have to say, sometimes uh, we don't understand everything that they've said, which is certainly the case with Zizek. But at the same time, there'll be some things that are said that you might disagree with, and then it's interesting to think about it and see what your own point of view is, and to see, why you have the point of view that you have, whether it holds up to critical analysis or not. So that's kind of one of the reasons why we study philosophy. We study what other people have to say. Not that we have to agree with what they have to say, but in most cases, it sort of stimulates thought and thinking about our own viewpoints. Lastly, it also seems to me, and Zizek doesn't seem to give much credence to this, but it seems like we've lost touch with something in ourselves as a result of living in the modern world, and as a result of our immersion in sort of the world of technology. And that it's in my classes here in the city. I mean, we're surrounded by buildings, concrete, automobiles, buses, on the streets, sidewalks. I mean, there's very little. You have to struggle to get areas of green so that people can be reminded at least of nature and so forth. So you feel like it's kind of an unnatural environment within which to live, and maybe not the best for us as human beings. I mean, there's a lot to be said for living in cities, but there's also a kind of price for it. And it seems we emphasize maybe too much in the way that we lived, too much one part of ourselves, and over other parts of ourselves. So this desire, I mean, to reconnect with the whole of ourselves seems like a reasonable desire on my part. It feels like we can live lives that, uh, in a sense, are out of balance. They become too intellectual, to academics. So we're more than that, and it seems like our involvement in nature engages more of ourselves than uh, than our living in the midst of kind of artificial environments does. So why not try to reconnect with that sense of things?